This is not the picture of a rock band. This is the picture of like superheroes or supervillains. These were comic book characters. This was a movie poster, something so much bigger. Hey, welcome to part 5 of our series on the A&E biography about KISS called KISStory. And what it was, a few years ago, A&E put out this biography. It was a 2-part thing that basically told the history of KISS, and they called it KISStory. And throughout this video, they'd have these little montages that would show pictures and videos from different time periods, and they showed a lot of newspaper headlines that would flash across the screen during this biography. And we thought what we would do on this channel, since we spend a lot of time going back and looking at old newspapers and things like that, we would go and find the newspapers that those headlines were from. And then we show you the newspaper that it was in and show you the headline again, and then kind of go through it and show you what the article that they were flashing across the screen, what it actually said. And so anyway, we're on part 5 now. The part that we're in right now, it happens in the first episode. Again, this is a 2-part thing, and it happens right around the 1 hour and 5 minute mark. And right now on the screen, I'm showing you an image from the biography. You can see the headline there, and the headline says, and it's cut off a little bit because they were panning it across the screen. The headline says, "KISS Invites Audience Fantasies." And then now I'm going to switch, and you can see on your screen right now, we actually found the newspaper, and this is from the Terre Haute Tribune in Terre Haute, Indiana. And what's kind of interesting about this particular newspaper article is we put out a video on this channel, I don't know, a couple months ago, where we talked about the album Rock and Roll Over, and coincidentally, we actually went through this very article, but from a totally different newspaper. So this article was something that was basically some sort of a press release that was put out, and then it was put across by the Associated Press, and it was put across all these different newspapers around the country. And so the one that we tracked down that they showed in the biography in KISStory is from the Terre Haute Tribune, December 12th of 1976. And there you can see the headline. It says, "KISS Invites Audience Fantasies." And so, first of all, down in the first comment, we'll put a link to the original video that we did on Rock and Roll Over, which is actually, I tell this really cool story about Paul Stanley. And there's a lot of other really cool stuff in that video. It's actually one where me and Gary both talk about that album. But what I'm going to do now, since this is from this particular newspaper, I almost skipped it and thought, well, we already talked about this. But part of what makes these little videos interesting that we go back and do for where we're going back and finding these headlines is actually just looking at the newspaper as a kind of a timestamp and seeing what else that newspaper had in it. And there are some pretty cool things in this particular newspaper. And again, this is in December 12th of 1976. So this is right before Christmas. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to take you to a few different things. The first thing I do when I find these articles is I'll go check the front page and see what the headlines were for that day. And I actually found something pretty fascinating here on the front page. So it's the Terre Haute, I'm not sure how you say it, Tribune Star. And check this out. I thought this is such an interesting timestamp. Because look at that headline right there. Record deficit for 77 hinted. Now, when you put this again in a time, when you look at this from a timestamp point of view, December 12, 1976, this is right after the election. So Jimmy Carter had just been elected, but he wasn't the president yet. And so, and actually when I went through this newspaper, there are just article after article after article about the election, about Carter. But this one on the front page was so interesting to me when you look at what this had to say. And this is not a political show. This channel is not about politics. But this is something, no matter where you're coming from, we can all kind of relate to. And I think this is super fascinating. So December 12, 1976, record deficit for 77 hinted. And the first paragraph says, President Carter probably will have to propose a record budget deficit for fiscal 1977 if he decides a government program is needed to stimulate the economy, his advisors say. And I remember, I was a little kid at this time, but I do remember people talking about inflation. I remember people being worried about the economy, and But this part is what really fascinated me. If you look over to, let's see here, over to this next paragraph, and I'm kind of moving the cursor over it right now. It says the deficit for fiscal 1977, which started last October 1st, already is likely to be near, get this, $60 billion, according to congressional budget experts. Anything Carter does to increase spending or cut taxes is almost certain to push it above the record deficit of $65.6 billion in fiscal 1976, they add. If Carter decides to, on the $15 billion to $20 billion job and tax cut program his advisors are recommending, the potential 1977 budget deficit could be as high as $80 billion. Oh, for the days when people were being financially responsible and only having deficits of $80 billion. I mean, it's just, it's so fascinating how we've, just looking at this, how we've become numb to it. $80 billion. Because what I do remember about this time, and I remember it more from the 80s, I don't remember it from the 70s, but I remember when we were in these billion-dollar deficits, how people were talking about how utterly irresponsible it was. And here we are today. I mean, just think about that. And I actually looked it up because I was so interested to think about this. So the deficit they were looking at could be as high as $80 billion. I looked it up, and around this time, the debt was in the neighborhood of $700 billion. Again, just from a timestamp standpoint, how our perspective on these numbers have changed so dramatically back when the word billion actually meant something. And today it's almost meaningless. Anyway, just kind of fascinating to look at this from this is the world that was happening at the time that when KISS was coming out with, this was 1976, this was the bicentennial, and this was when KISS that year had put out 2 albums, and I actually have them out here. The Destroyer came out on March 15th of 1976, and then Rock and Roll Over came out on November 11th of 1976. So anyway, that's what was going on in the country when these records are coming out. Next thing I found that was kind of fun was RadioShack. How many of you remember RadioShack? When I was a kid and I was getting involved, I started playing the guitar. I was at RadioShack all the time, just buying cables because I was, had my guitar equipment and then I had my stereo equipment and I was figuring out all the different types of cables and connectors. And I was at RadioShack all the time, just buying stuff. And I used to love RadioShack because you could find those things that you needed pretty quickly. If I needed a guitar cable, there was a RadioShack right down the block and I could just go get one. And it was just a different time back then when we had that little electronics store just right around the corner, and they were everywhere. And I don't even remember what it was, but it was some time ago, maybe a couple decades ago, they just poof, gone. But here's a RadioShack. You remember these RadioShack Christmas sale? And they would sell these things at RadioShack. There you have you remember the CBs? This one was regularly $149.95, now $99.95. Then you have this hi-fi system for $349 that had a turntable. And remember, the brand was Realistic. I think I still have a Realistic equalizer up in the storage area somewhere. There's a Realistic battery AC recorder. Did any of you ever own any of these things? And then Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops. It looked like they were selling it looks like, is that a record? Yeah, because they have record, cassette tape, and 8-track tape. So they actually sold some of those things there. And then this one was the one that really got me. Ultra thin calculator, $24.95. And look what it'll do. Basically add, subtract, multiply, divide. I mean, it's just... And it's only 7/16 of an inch thin. Anyway, just crazy. And then these science fair kits, 151 electronic project kit, 250 in one chemistry lab kit. What could possibly go wrong, right? 601 electrochemical laboratory. Whoa. Anyway, again, what could go wrong with that stuff? I actually when we had our science fairs at school, I remember buying one of those things for the science fair. Okay, this one always gets me when we do these newspapers. When you go look at when we look at the movies that were in the theaters. Do you remember this? King Kong. It says the most exciting original motion picture event of all time. King Kong. I remember seeing that in the theater, and it was just so amazing. I love that show. And you remember how at the very end of it, he was on the World Trade Center right there. That's the first time, when we were growing up, we even knew what that was. And then there's King Kong. Oh my gosh, I remember that whole thing when they went to the island and they had the big wall there and they had to, it was, anyway, what a cool show. I think it was Jeff Bridges, Jessica Lange. Where is that? They don't have their names here. I should have looked. Oh, there it is. Oh yeah, there it is. Duh. Jeff Bridges, Jessica Lange. And they were just awesome. What a great movie that was. It was so cool. And then let's see, there were a couple other Woolco TV family fun games. Check that out. Wonder Wizard, 3 games for $59.97. This is what, those are the video games we played. And then there were a couple of other, let's see here. Oh, here it is. Logan's Run. Do you remember the movie Logan's Run? As I recall, we actually went and saw this in the theater. And that movie is an interesting timestamp for a couple of reasons, because it came out right around the same time that Star Wars did. And when you go back and watch Logan's Run and you compare the special effects between Star Wars and Logan's Run, even though the Star Wars special effects have aged a little bit, they weren't even in the same world. And Logan's Run was this really interesting kind of sci-fi show, but it just didn't. It paled in comparison to what to Star Wars. But the story was so cool. I loved the story. Actually, I still love the story of Logan's Run. But if you go watch it right now, man, it is such a B level movie, but it is so much fun. It really is. The whole thing where the end. They go through that ice thing and they've got that robot that today looks like an overgrown vacuum cleaner. At the time, I remember being a kid and it just scared the heck out of me. And you go look at that thing now. If you have not looked at it in a while, get on YouTube, go find the scenes where they're going through like the ice hallway or something, and before they go outside into the real world. And there's that robot there that tries to stop them. And it looks so homemade and cheap. It's unbelievable. It looks like they made it out of dryer tubes and a big vacuum. It's so funny. But what a cool show. And then Rollerball, that was kind of a big deal. And then the Shaggy D.A. I remember we actually had that on a videotape. And I think I watched that over and over and over again. When we were little kids, me and my sisters, we loved the Shaggy D.A. That was a lot of fun. Okay, a couple more things in this newspaper. I thought this was kind of interesting. Again, it's interesting to put these from a timestamp standpoint, because here we are in 1976, and Fats Domino and George Jones were still around. But what makes it even more interesting is here they are in December in Terre Haute, Indiana, and they're playing the Executive Inn Motor Hotel, because George Jones was a legend country singer. And Fats Domino, of course, was a legendary, he's the one that did the twist. And just they were really, really important, but I don't know much about this Executive Inn and what this was all about, but it sure seems to me that it was probably a couple steps below where they were. Both of these people were, 15 years earlier. So, but George Jones, what a legend. What a legend he was. Okay, one more thing. Oh yeah. This one was the most fun for me. So this is the Zare Christmas sale. And they have a lot of these things. You remember a lot of times in these advertisements that have hand drawings, even for fashion images, they were always drawn. They were starting to see more and more photos at the time, but so there's Kodak film, but that's not what I wanted to show you. So this is I'm going to forward a couple of pages to show you the one that I found. When I was a little kid, I would have gone out of my mind with excitement on this page. And here it is. there you have Ernie and Bert, $1.99 each. There's the Count and there's Ernie. I would have, when I was a little kid, I would have gone nuts just looking at this page. Now look at this. This is a video game. Do you remember getting this? I remember having a little Pong thing like this. And you remember this little thing would move up and down on the screen and this ball would go back and forth. I was a master at that. I was spectacular at that game. But look down here. Do you remember any of these things? This Mr. Mouth? I don't know what it was. I remember this game, like this thing would spin around or something and then you'd shoot stuff into his mouth. That was wild. There's a Ouija board. Do you remember Cootie? This game, I loved Cootie because then you'd put the ears and the legs on it. That was fun. Yahtzee, what a blast. Then did you have, because I did, the $6 Million Man? Because you could look through his eye. He had the bionic arm where you could roll his sleeve up and you'd take the little bionics in and out of his arm. And that was, anyway, it was so much fun. And then these little things that had the record in the back of the choo-choo train. Anyway, did I just say choo-choo train? Well, it's in the back of, okay, I said choo-choo because it actually says choo-choo. It's not just me. Anyway, I loved this page because the memories of all this stuff is just crazy thinking about that. All right, so let's go back to the KISS article. So we go through all that stuff because it's a timestamp. And part of, for me, especially when I look at those movies and the toys, because I was a kid into KISS, like a lot of you were, you had these overlapping moments. Like I was a KISS fan while really liking to watch the Shaggy D.A. at the same time. And it was such a strange thing because we had these two kind of opposing worlds that were living inside of us when we were KISS fans, because we were still kind of had our foot in the world of being a little of a kid, and then you're into this hard rock and roll at the time. And anyway, the timestamp of it, like I said, makes this pretty fascinating. Okay, so now to put this in context, this is December 12th of 1976, and this year, these two albums, Destroyer and Rock and Roll Over, had both come out during 1976. And so here we were at the end of 1976, and then 1977, Love Gun would come out that year, and then later on in 1977 is when Alive 2 would come out, and then in 1978, that's when the solo albums came out, and then in 1979, that's when Dynasty came out. So anyway, that kind of puts all this in perspective. So in 1976, they were relatively new to being superstars. They had put out Alive, which really put them on the map, and then they put out Destroyer with Bob Ezrin as the producer, which is this one right here. And then that's the one that kind of solidified their position in the world of being rock stars, truly at that point. And that had come out again in March. And so here we are in December towards the end of the year. And then we have this article written that just says KISS Invites Audience Fantasies. And this is the one that is on the screen. And what's going on in the documentary at this point, if you haven't watched it in a while, and it's on Hulu right now, by the way, this is right about at the 1 hour and 5 minute mark. And this is where they're talking about the fact that they were never to be seen without their makeup. And Paul Stanley, right around here in the documentary, says, it's kind of disappointing that we weren't going to be recognized on the street, that when we were out and about, but the masquerade of it really, really worked. And what they had done then is they'd kind of put across this thing that they were never normal people. You only knew them as these characters. And they talk a little bit about this, not only in the documentary, but they talk a little bit about this here in this article. So I'm going to share this with you now. So this is on page, if you ever wanted to go look this up, this is on page 44. All right. Okay, Alice Cooper, who frightened parents with his female name and the violent images in the stage show, which went along with his rock concerts, now can take a backseat to KISS. And by the way, Alice Cooper, it is a female name, and he did it intentionally. When he came up with the name Alice Cooper, what he was really trying to do was come up with the most kind of American mom, grandma kind of name he could come up with. And he was thinking like Betty Crocker. Betty Crocker, he was thinking, is like the most American grandma, bake you cookies kind of name that there was. So he wanted something similar to that, and he came up with Alice Cooper. That was the idea. And then, of course, his persona would be the exact opposite of what the name was. And so he's saying now he can take a backseat to KISS. For one thing, there are 4 members of KISS, and they are enormously popular. The producer of their 5th record album, Destroyer, Bob Ezrin, said the album conveys the group's image as, quote, symbols of just unfettered evil and sexuality. Now, this is kind of a fascinating thing that Bob Ezrin said that, because what they say next, the band members, it was a little bit, when you hear this, it's a little bit like they distance themselves from that idea, because they want you in some ways to be able to project what you think onto them. They're just putting characters out there, and then you kind of put yourself in them. And it worked, because I know there are people on this channel that did what I did, because you've put it in comments on other KISS videos we've done, where me and my friend Tommy Leet, we used to get out, it was a Live 2 was the main one we'd do this with. We'd put the record on and we'd grab tennis rackets and we would just be KISS. And everybody had the one that they related to somehow. There was something that you'd project it onto them and you'd think that's the one I relate to the most. And I was always Paul Stanley. So members of KISS, their ages are 24 to 30, don't make statements like that. Again, like Bob Ezrin did, preferring to present themselves as mysterious. They don't want to say that they're evil and sexy or that they're really nice, normal guys off stage. Alice Cooper recently has been saying the latter about himself. KISS members don't permit photographs of themselves out of stage makeup. Bassist Gene Simmons explains, it would blow the magic. Guitarist Paul Stanley adds, there's a lot more mystique and glamour to the stage image than the 4 of us being normal looking. And really that was kind of the idea, this mystique. And I know we've talked about this before on this channel, but just look at this album cover. This was such a fascinating thing because they weren't a rock band. This is not the picture of a rock band. This is the picture of like superheroes or supervillains or something like that. These were comic book characters. This was a movie poster. This was something so much bigger than these guys are just musicians. This was a fantasy characters here. And when you look at it and you think about superheroes, you think about things like something that came out around the same time, and I may have even talked about this in a recent KISS video, but it bears repeating because the point is so important. When you look back at so many movies, when you look at comic books, when you look at Star Wars, for example, which came out around right in this same time period, the good guys and the bad guys, you almost loved them equally. I mean, look at your Marvel comic characters. Some of the most famous characters that people really gravitate towards are the bad guys. Just because you think they're cool. They're cool looking. They have these cool personalities. They have these great backstories. And this was similar with these guys. Gene Simmons, of course, was the demon, but it was a little bit, you'd love him this kind of the same way you would love Darth Vader. Yeah, he's the bad guy, but you kind of like him. He's cool looking. What villain is cooler looking ever than Darth Vader is? And he has that great voice, and he's got there's just something about him that's so awesome. And that was part of what made this so brilliant, was that you'd see these guys and whether they were good guys, bad guys was kind of irrelevant, a little bit like Darth Vader is, because it's just cool. And you understand why, getting back to what I said a little while ago, why as kids we started gravitating toward this, because this was comic book, this was fantasy, this was like these bigger than life characters, adventure. It felt awesome just looking at this stuff. And as a little kid, you'd buy these records, you'd stare at this thinking, whoa, this is so awesome. And then of course you'd grab your tennis racket, put the music on, and then suddenly you're the character. Okay, they want audience members to be free to build whatever fantasies they want around one or all members of KISS. And interview with Simmons and Stanley begins with Simmons wearing jeans, shirt, no makeup, platform boots, silver spider bracelet, necklace of silver skulls, and brown spider belt buckle, offering cake made by his mother. And there you go. You know, I heard somebody say not long ago, they were talking about how we have, with social media, we have so much access to the rock stars today. And you think, would I have had the same love of Jimmy Page, for example, if I knew what he had for breakfast every day? You don't want to know those things because there's the mystery of it all. You were limited to your exposure. When Led Zeppelin would show up somewhere in a magazine or a newspaper or in concert, it was one of the few times you'd get to experience them. You were very, very limited. And today, not only do we get overwhelmed where we can see anything we want all the time, forever, but we also know the intimate details of their lives, and then it just takes some of that mystique away. And so and these guys went the exact opposite there. And it's just kind of an interesting part of comparison, because there you see that they really did have these normal lives, but we just were never exposed to them. Where today we have almost overexposure with so many of these people, and you think, would I have been so into Jimmy Page or Robert Plant or just going back and list all these people if we'd have known as much about them and their personal lives as we know about rock stars today? Just a different world, something interesting to think or talk about. KISS got together in 1973. Makeup, smoke bombs, flash pots, and flying sparks were part of the show from the start. Simmons says, quote, "We didn't want to be another boring band. We wanted to be the greatest show on earth." Simmons, born in the borough of Queens, and Stanley, born in Manhattan, got together. By the way, I think when they say born, they just kind of mean from, because of course Gene Simmons was born in Israel, so it's not exactly correct here, but they're all from New York. Got together, added drummer Peter Criss from Brooklyn. From an ad he ran in Rolling Stone, and added lead guitarist Ace Frehley from the Bronx. From an ad they ran in the Village Voice. Being New Yorkers, their hero band was the New York Dolls, which was the #1 draw in the city at the time. And of course, we have another video on this channel, and maybe I'll put the link to that one down below in the first comment as well, where we find an old newspaper article that talks about one of those early shows where you had the Dolls and KISS playing together, because that was a big thing back then, because KISS and the Dolls would play together frequently. And that was an important part of the development of KISS, where New York Dolls did have this massive impact across, generations of music, but they never really took off the way KISS did. They were, even though they influenced KISS greatly, they did not have the mass appeal somehow that KISS did. KISS started with female makeup and tried clown makeup before evolving the present black and silver faces and costumes. They noted that the Dolls were very New Yorkish, and audiences elsewhere felt they were left out of an inside joke. So KISS relied on hard rock and magic tricks. Manager Bill Aucoin, a TV director formerly, took on the group because he thought Alice Cooper had built up an audience for flamboyant stage shows, which he soon would leave to become an actor. And that, I said this, I think, in the other video, this is not really entirely true. He did put out a movie that was called Sextet, and if you ever, matter of fact, you can go find him in that movie on YouTube. He's got his hair short and he's playing a piano, and it's kind of a silly thing, a little bit of a comedy. And anyway, he's in there, and he did a movie, Welcome to My Night. So that was in 78. He did a movie, Welcome to My Nightmare, in 76, which didn't do very well. So when it says he was leaving it to become an actor, that's not entirely true. He did go dabble in acting, but it wasn't as though he just kind of left the Alice Cooper rock star behind, because he didn't really. He thought hard rock was very commercial, and he thought the group wanted to become superstars. This is getting back to Bill Aucoin. He got them signed to Casablanca Records, a new company, as its first group. And that's kind of an important thing to note, that Casablanca, Neil Bogart created this label, and KISS was the band. And it's fascinating watching Casablanca, because they became kind of a disco label eventually over time. And so KISS was a little bit of an oddball on that label once it got going. But, the reality of it is KISS paid a lot of bills with that record company and with a coin management. And anyway, they were the people. They were the breadwinners, if you will, in that KISS had just become such a juggernaut and so successful. But Casablanca was started, and then KISS and Casablanca kind of grew together, if you will. At first, Stanley says, we had day jobs as cab drivers. From 6 to 10, we were stars. And from 10 to midnight, we were going around putting up posters we designed ourselves, saying we were stars. I love that. It's such a great quote. From the beginning, they performed 200 to 250 days a year. A vacation was time spent in one city making a record. The group was a theatrical stage band, but they knew the music had to be good or audiences would quit coming. And this was a pretty important thing. When it says a vacation was going to one city and making a record, when you look at those early days of KISS, even through here, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, these records were both put out the same year. And that's the kind of work that they were doing. They were putting out so much stuff so fast. And anyway, it was just kind of a big deal that they were working like crazy. And the truth is, and a lot of people want to knock them, but you go back even to the early days, the first album, and they had just good, catchy tunes. You don't have to like them. You don't have to like the way they did things. You don't have to, but the reality of it is they wrote catchy music. And eventually that part of it caught up with the act part of it, if you will. So where that was kind of the draw in some ways, they did have really solid, catchy tunes behind it. The music has improved, Stanley and Simmons believe, from playing together so much. And then that's the end of the article. And then there's the picture of the band. KISS, the hard rock quartet, never photographed without makeup, is, from left, Peter Criss, Ace Frehley, Gene Simmons, and Paul Stanley. Anyway, that's the end of that article. And that's, again, taken from about an hour and 5 minutes into part 1 of the KISStory biography. So if you go on Hulu, which is where it is right now, and find the A&E KISStory biography, that's where you'll see all these articles that we've been doing. And we've basically, if you go back a week, we've been doing them each Monday, and we'll probably keep doing it like that, where every Monday we put one of these out until we get through both of them. And so I hope you enjoy these things. And please, if you're not following the channel already, please follow the channel, like the video. And if you're a KISS fan, you probably know other KISS fans. And we'd really appreciate it if you would take the time right now to share this, copy the URL, post it on your Facebook page, send it an email to some people you know, put it on your Twitter account or whatever you have on social media, just to let other people, because that's how these channels grow, is word of mouth, people sending these things to each other. And we really, really appreciate when you do that. Oh, and by the way, we'd love to get your comments on any of this stuff. All these things that we found in the newspaper. Did you experience any of those things? Did you have any of those toys? Did you see any of those movies? What was do you remember that stuff? And what are your memories about them? And then also these two records that we talked about that came out of 1976, where do these fit for you as far as your favorite KISS stuff? And there you go. So please leave those things down in the comments. We love hearing from you. And with that, have yourself a fantastic day.